Welcome back to Sleep 2 RPG, where epic gaming lore meets peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey into the tragic realm of Dark Souls to explore the complete story of the Age of Fire and the doomed sacrifice of Lord Gwyn. Over the next few hours, we'll uncover the rise and fall of the greatest of the lords, the consequences of his desperate attempt to preserve his age, and the endless cycle of sacrifice that followed. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin this melancholic adventure together into the fading embers of a dying world. Chapter 1: Before the Fire. In the beginning, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog, a land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. This was the Age of Ancients, a time without disparity, without meaning, without change. The world existed in perfect, eternal stasis, neither growing nor dying, neither warm nor cold, neither light nor dark. It simply was, unchanging and unmoving, like a painting left unfinished for eternity. The everlasting dragons ruled this grey realm, though ruled may be too strong a word. They simply existed, perched atop their arch trees, immortal and immutable. Their stone scales made them impervious to all harm, their ancient bodies harder than the very mountains beneath them. They were creatures of pure stasis, embodying the unchanging nature of their age. Time itself moved differently in this ancient world, if it moved at all. Without the concepts of life and death, beginning and end, the very notion of progression was meaningless. The dragons did not age, did not grow, did not learn or change. They were eternal monuments to permanence, living statues in a world that knew no sculpture. Yet beneath this grey uniformity, forces stirred that would shatter the ancient order forever. Deep in the earth, in places where the very foundations of reality grew thin, something new was awakening. A power unlike anything the world had known, a force that would bring not just change, but the very concept of change itself. But then there was fire, and with fire came disparity. The first flame appeared without warning, without explanation, a cosmic rupture in the fabric of unchanging existence. It brought with it concepts that had never existed before: heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. Most importantly, it brought the possibility of difference itself, the idea that things could be other than what they were. From the dark, they came, hollow creatures, drawn to the warmth and light of this primordial fire like moths to a candle. These beings, perhaps the first truly living things the world had ever known, discovered something extraordinary within the flame's heart. Souls. 4 great souls of immense power, each one containing the essence of fundamental forces that would reshape the world. The first soul was claimed by one who would become known as Gravlord Nito, the first of the dead. His soul granted him dominion over death itself, the power to bring endings to a world that had never known them. In claiming this soul, Nito became the first being to truly understand mortality, to know that existence could have boundaries and limits. The second soul fell to the Witch of Izalith, whose very essence blazed with the power of life and flame. She would wield fire as both creator and destroyer, nurturing new forms of existence while burning away the old. Her soul contained the vital force that would animate the new world, the spark that would kindle countless other flames. The third soul was discovered by one called the Furtive Pygmy, a being so humble that even the fragments of lore barely remember his name. Yet his discovery was perhaps the most significant of all: the dark soul from which all humanity would spring. This soul contained the essence of mankind's potential, their capacity for growth, change, and self-determination. And the fourth soul, the greatest and most radiant of all, was claimed by one who would come to be known as Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. His soul burned with the pure radiance of light itself, granting him mastery over lightning and the very rays of the sun. From the moment he grasped that blazing fragment of creation, Gwyn's destiny was sealed. He would become the greatest of the lords, the king of gods, and ultimately the architect of his own eternal torment. But that torment lay far in the future. First, there was a war to be won. The discovery of the Lord's souls marked the true beginning of the end for the Age of Ancients. The dragons, who had existed in perfect stasis for eons beyond counting, suddenly faced beings who embodied the very concept of change. Where the dragons represented permanence, the lords represented transformation. Where the dragons were content to simply exist, the lords burned with purpose and ambition. This fundamental incompatibility made conflict inevitable. The dragons saw the lords as a disruption to the natural order, an infection of chaos in their perfectly ordered world. The lords saw the dragons as obstacles to growth and development, relics of a stagnant past that must be swept away to make room for the future. Gwyn, empowered by his lord soul and driven by visions of what the world could become, began to organize the other lords into an alliance. It was no small task. Beings of such immense power were not easily united under a single banner. But Gwyn possessed not only strength, but charisma, the ability to inspire others to share his vision of a world transformed. The Witch of Izalith, with her mastery over flame and her understanding of life's creative forces, saw in Gwyn's proposal the chance to nurture new forms of existence. Her daughters, the Daughters of Chaos, shared her enthusiasm for the possibilities that victory would bring. Nito, the Grave Lord, understood that a world of true change required the possibility of endings as well as beginnings. His power over death would be essential in bringing mortality to beings that had never known it. The armies of the dead that served him would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. Even the furtive pygmy, though he remained largely in the shadows, contributed to the alliance. From his dark soul, he created humanity itself, a new race of beings who would serve as foot soldiers in the war against the dragons. These early humans, empowered by fragments of the dark soul, possessed a fierce determination and adaptability that would prove crucial in the battles to come. But perhaps the most significant addition to Gwyn's alliance was not another Lord Soul Bearer, but a dragon. Seath the Scaleless was born different from his kin, lacking the stone scales that granted them immortality. This deficiency made him vulnerable, but also gave him something his brothers lacked: the capacity for change, for growth, for envy and ambition. Seath's betrayal of his own kind was motivated by jealousy and spite, but it was also a recognition that the age of unchanging existence was ending. By allying with the Lords, he chose transformation over stagnation, even knowing that it meant the destruction of everything he had once known. With their alliance complete, the Lords prepared for war, but they quickly discovered that the everlasting dragons were not easily defeated. Their stone scales made them immune to conventional weapons, their ancient bodies resistant to fire and magic. For each dragon that fell, 70 of Gwyn's soldiers perished. Victory seemed impossible. The tide of war turned when Gwyn discovered the true power of his Lord's soul. The lightning he could summon was not merely another weapon, it was the concentrated essence of light itself, pure and uncompromising. These bolts of heaven proved capable of something no other force could achieve. They could strip away the dragon's protective scales, leaving them vulnerable to the powers of his allies. Once Gwyn's lightning had torn away their immortal armor, Nito's death could claim them, and the witch's flames could burn their ancient bodies to ash. Seath's knowledge of draconic anatomy allowed the Alliance to target their enemies' weaknesses with devastating precision. The war that followed was not swift, nor was it merciful. Ancient battlefields were carved into the very landscape. their scars still visible eons later. The sky itself was torn asunder by the clash of primordial forces, lightning and flame warring against stone and scale. But in the end, the dragons fell. Their ancient civilization was reduced to ruins, their wisdom scattered to the winds. A few survivors fled to distant places, but their age was over. The lords had won, but at a terrible cost. The world itself bore the wounds of their victory, transformed beyond recognition by the violence of their triumph. Most tragically, the war had revealed something about the nature of victory itself. In order to defeat beings who represented unchanging permanence, the lords had been forced to become agents of destruction. The very power that allowed them to create the new world required them to utterly obliterate the old one. This paradox would haunt Gwyn for the rest of his existence. He had fought for the principle of change and growth, but his methods had required wholesale destruction. He had championed the value of life and creativity, but his victory was built upon unprecedented slaughter. Perhaps most troubling of all, the war had taught Gwyn to fear. He had learned that even the mightiest civilizations could fall, that even the most ancient and established orders could be swept away by new forces. The dragon's defeat was his triumph, but it was also a lesson in the fragility of all achievements. This fear would shape everything that followed. When Gwyn built his own kingdom, he would do so with the knowledge that it too could fall. When he witnessed the flame beginning to fade, he would remember the fate of the dragons and determine that his age would not suffer the same destiny. The irony, of course, was that this determination would lead him to make choices that were far more destructive than anything the natural cycle of ages could have inflicted. In seeking to avoid the dragon's fate, he would create a system that was infinitely more cruel and wasteful than their ancient rule had ever been. But all of that lay in the future. For now, there was only victory and the promise of a new world built upon the ashes of the old. The Age of Fire had begun, and with it came possibilities that the grey world of the dragons had never dreamed of. Light and warmth spread across the land, bringing with them new forms of life, new ways of being, new hopes for what existence could become. Gwyn stood at the center of this transformation, the Lord of Sunlight in an age that worshipped the sun. His power was unquestioned, his authority unassailable. He had led the alliance that shattered the ancient order and opened the way for a new kind of civilization. Yet even in his moment of triumph, the seeds of future tragedy were already being sown. For in overthrowing the dragons, Gwyn had not just won a war, he had set a precedent. He had proven that even the most ancient and powerful orders could be toppled by those with sufficient will and strength. This lesson would not be lost on others, particularly on humanity itself. The humans who had fought in his armies, who had bled and died for his cause, would remember that gods could be defeated, that established orders could be challenged, that change was always possible. The dark soul that empowered them carried within it the same potential for transformation that had driven Gwyn to victory over the dragons. But where Gwyn's power was focused on light and preservation, humanity's was rooted in darkness and change. The very forces that had enabled his triumph contained within them the seeds of his eventual downfall. For now, though, such concerns seemed distant and abstract. The Age of Fire stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. There were kingdoms to build, civilizations to nurture, wonders to create. The hard work of construction could begin, the gentler arts of peace could flourish. Gwyn would prove to be not just a great warrior, but a skilled ruler, building the magnificent city of Anor Londo and establishing the institutions that would govern the new age. His children would inherit his divine power. His knights would become legends in their own right. His influence would spread across the known world. But beneath all of this success, the fundamental questions raised by the war against the dragons remained unanswered. What gave any age the right to rule forever? What made preservation more valuable than change? When did the desire to protect what one valued become the tyranny of imposing one's will on others? These questions would eventually demand answers, and when they did, Gwyn would discover that the power which had made him the greatest of the lords was not sufficient to resolve the contradictions inherent in his position. The lightning that had stripped the scales from ancient dragons could not illuminate the darkness in his own heart, the fear and pride that would ultimately consume everything he sought to protect. The Age of Fire began with the promise of light conquering darkness, of order defeating chaos, of progress triumphing over stagnation. It would end with the recognition that such simple binaries were illusions, that light and dark were parts of the same cycle, that true wisdom lay not in choosing one over the other, but in understanding when to embrace each in its proper season. But that understanding would come at a terrible price, paid not just by Gwyn himself, but by countless generations of heroes who would be caught up in the machine of sacrifice he would create. The war against the dragons was only the beginning of the story, the opening chapter, in a tragedy that would span millennia and consume the very best of what his age could produce. Chapter 2: The Lord of Sunlight. With the ancient dragons defeated and the Age of Fire begun, Gwyn set about the monumental task of building a new world from the ashes of the old. His victory had made him the undisputed leader of the Lords, the one to whom others looked for guidance in shaping the transformed earth. It was a responsibility he embraced with the same fierce determination that had driven him to victory in the Dragon Wars. The first and greatest of his achievements was the creation of Anor Londo, the city of the gods. Built in the depths of the earth yet somehow bathed in eternal sunlight, this magnificent metropolis would serve as both the seat of divine power and a symbol of what the Age of Fire could accomplish. Its soaring spires reached toward the heavens. Its golden halls echoed with the voices of gods and their servants. Its very existence proclaimed the triumph of light over the grey stagnation of the ancient world. Every aspect of Anor Londo's design reflected Gwyn's vision of divine perfection. The architecture was at once imposing and beautiful, demonstrating power while inspiring awe rather than fear. The eternal sunlight that bathed the city was not harsh or blinding, but warm and welcoming, creating an atmosphere of perpetual golden afternoon that spoke of peace and prosperity. The city became home not just to Gwyn himself, but to his growing family and the court of divine beings that gathered around him. These gods, born from the power of the Lord's souls, or elevated through exceptional service, formed a new kind of aristocracy, based not on mere birth, but on spiritual authority and divine mandate. At the center of this divine court stood Gwyn's children, each one inheriting aspects of their father's power, while developing their own unique characteristics and roles. His firstborn son became a god of war, inheriting Gwyn's mastery of lightning and his martial prowess. This unnamed prince would lead the Knights of Anor Londo in battle, serving as both military commander and symbol of divine might. Gwyn's daughter Guinevere grew into the Princess of Sunlight, a goddess of fertility and abundance whose very presence brought prosperity and growth. Her radiant beauty and warm demeanor made her beloved throughout the kingdom, a living embodiment of the Age of Fire's promise of plenty and happiness. In time, Gwyn would father another child, Gwyndolin, born under very different circumstances, where his other children embodied aspects of solar power and authority. Gwyndolin was born with an affinity for the moon and its mysteries. This difference troubled Gwyn, who associated darkness with the enemies of his age, and he made the fateful decision to raise his son as a daughter, as if changing the child's presentation could alter his fundamental nature. This treatment of Gwyndolin revealed one of Gwyn's greatest character flaws, his inability to accept that which did not conform to his vision of how things should be. The same rigid thinking that had made him an effective war leader would prove disastrous when applied to more complex moral and familial situations. Beyond his immediate family, Gwyn surrounded himself with knights and servants who embodied the highest ideals of the Age of Fire. The 4 Knights of Gwyn, Ornstein the Dragon Slayer, Artorius the Abyss Walker, Hawkeye Goth, and Lord's Blade Kirin, became legendary figures in their own right, each one representing a different aspect of knightly virtue. Ornstein served as the captain of Gwyn's personal guard, his golden armor and dragon-slaying spear making him a living symbol of the god's victory over the Ancient Order. His dedication to duty and martial excellence embodied the ideals of loyalty and strength that Gwyn valued above all else. Artorius was perhaps the most noble of the 4, a knight whose compassion was matched only by his courage. He would range far from Anor Londo on missions of mercy and justice, becoming a beloved figure among the human populations that looked to the gods for protection and guidance. Hawkeye Goth represented the contemplative side of knighthood, a giant of a man whose skill with the bow was matched by his wisdom and strategic thinking. He served as both sniper and advisor, providing counsel in matters both military and philosophical. Kirin, the only woman among the 4, embodied the more subtle aspects of divine service. Her mastery of assassination techniques and stealth made her invaluable for missions that required discretion rather than open force. Together, these knights and others like them created the military force that would maintain order throughout the Age of Fire. But they were more than just soldiers. They were examples of what mortals could aspire to become, living proof that service to the gods could elevate ordinary beings to extraordinary heights. The influence of Anor Londo extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Human kingdoms across the surface world looked to the City of Gods for guidance, establishing religious and political connections that would shape civilization for millennia to come. The Way of White, a religious order dedicated to Gwyn's teachings, spread his philosophy of order and purpose throughout the known world. This philosophy emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the subordination of individual desires to higher purposes. Humans were taught that their proper role was to serve the gods faithfully, that their salvation lay in obedience to divine will, and that death in service to the light was the highest honor they could achieve. While these teachings brought order and meaning to many lives, they also served Gwyn's political purposes by creating populations that were psychologically prepared to accept their role as servants rather than equals. The very religion that promised spiritual elevation also ensured temporal submission. The establishment of this hierarchical order was one of Gwyn's most significant achievements, creating a stable system that would endure long after his own death. But it also contained within it the seeds of future conflicts, as it denied humanity's true potential as inheritors of the Dark Soul, and relegated them to a permanently subordinate position. During these golden years of the Age of Fire, Gwyn also made crucial decisions about how to distribute the power of his Lord's soul. Unlike his fellow lords, who kept their souls intact, Gwyn chose to fragment his power and share it with others. This decision was motivated by both generosity and strategic thinking. By creating other beings with substantial spiritual authority, he could extend his influence while also ensuring that his vision would survive, even if something happened to him personally. Significant portions of his soul went to Seath the Scaleless, rewarding the dragon's crucial betrayal of his own kind. Seath was granted dukedom and given the Grand Archives as his domain, where he could pursue his researches into the nature of immortality and magic. This decision would have profound consequences, as Seath's subsequent madness and crimes would cast a shadow over the entire Age of Fire. Other fragments of Gwyn's soul were granted to the 4 kings of New Londo, human rulers who had proven their loyalty and effectiveness in governing their underwater kingdom. This sharing of divine power with mortals was intended to demonstrate that faithful service could be rewarded with elevation to near godhood. These distributions of power were generally successful in achieving their immediate goals, creating a network of powerful allies who shared Gwyn's vision and had personal stakes in maintaining the current order. But they also diluted his own strength, a decision that would prove crucial when the flame began to fade and he needed maximum power to address the crisis. As the Age of Fire matured and Anor Londo reached its full glory, Gwyn found himself in the peculiar position of having achieved everything he had initially sought. The dragons were defeated, his kingdom was prosperous, his influence extended across the known world, and his family carried on his divine legacy. By any reasonable measure, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Yet success brought its own form of suffering. The very achievements that should have brought satisfaction instead created new anxieties and responsibilities. The greater his power became, the more he had to lose. The more extensive his kingdom grew, the more threats he could perceive at its borders. The more his family and followers depended on him, the more weight he felt on his shoulders. Perhaps most troubling of all, Gwyn began to notice subtle signs that the Age of Fire was not as eternal as he had hoped. The first flame, which had seemed inexhaustible when first discovered, showed occasional signs of dimming. These fluctuations were minor and temporary, but they reminded him that even the most fundamental forces of existence were subject to change and eventual decline. This knowledge awakened in Gwyn the same fear that had motivated him during the Dragon Wars, the fear of losing everything he had worked to build. But where he had once faced external enemies that could be fought with sword and lightning, he now confronted the possibility of internal decay that might not be resistible through conventional means. His response to these early warnings revealed another aspect of his character that would prove fateful: his inability to accept limitations on his control. Where other leaders might have sought to prepare for eventual succession or to build institutions that could survive their founders, Gwyn began to search for ways to make his reign truly eternal. This search led him to study the nature of the first flame itself, seeking to understand the source of the power that had made the Age of Fire possible. What he discovered was both illuminating and terrifying. The flame was not self-sustaining, but required periodic renewal through the sacrifice of powerful souls. Without such sacrifice, it would eventually burn out, ending the age and ushering in whatever came next. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Everything Gwyn had built, everything he valued, everything he considered good and beautiful in the world depended on a flame that was slowly but inexorably dying. Unless he could find a way to replenish its power, his entire civilization would eventually fade into darkness. This knowledge might have prompted other leaders to begin preparing for the transition, to establish succession plans, or to gradually shift power to those who might be better suited to rule in a different kind of age. But Gwyn's character made such acceptance impossible. Having fought so hard to create his world, he could not bear the thought of allowing it to end. The first signs of his growing obsession with preservation appeared in his treatment of his firstborn son. The prince, who had inherited his father's love of battle and his mastery of lightning, began to show signs of sympathy for the dragons that still survived in distant places. Perhaps this sympathy grew from his warrior's respect for worthy opponents, or perhaps it reflected a deeper understanding of the cyclical nature of existence. Whatever its source, this sympathy enraged Gwyn, who saw it as a betrayal of everything the Age of Fire represented. His son's willingness to ally with dragons seemed to threaten the very foundations of divine authority, suggesting that even the gods themselves might be subject to change and evolution. Rather than trying to understand his son's perspective, or to find a way to reconcile their differences, Gwyn chose the harsh path of absolute punishment. He stripped his firstborn of his divine status, erased his name from all records, and cast him out from Anor Londo forever. The prince who had once been heir to the throne of gods became the nameless king, a figure of such shame that even his identity was forbidden to be spoken. This decision revealed the extent to which fear had begun to corrupt Gwyn's judgment. The same man who had once been capable of uniting diverse allies in common cause now saw difference of opinion as existential threat. The same leader who had built his kingdom through inclusion and reward now resorted to exile and erasure when faced with dissent. The banishment of his firstborn also demonstrated Gwyn's growing inability to distinguish between personal loyalty and principled disagreement. His son's sympathy for dragons did not necessarily represent a rejection of the Age of Fire or a desire to overthrow the divine order. It might simply have reflected a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between ruler and ruled, conqueror and conquered. But Gwyn could no longer tolerate such nuance. As his fear of the flame's eventual fading grew stronger, his thinking became increasingly black and white. Those who supported him completely were allies. Anyone who showed even slight deviation from his vision was a potential enemy. This binary thinking would characterize all of his subsequent decisions, leading him to make increasingly extreme choices in service of what he saw as an existential struggle for the survival of his age. The Lord who had once embodied the wisdom and justice of divine rule gradually transformed into something much darker, a tyrant whose love for his creation had become indistinguishable from his terror of losing it. Yet even as these character flaws became more pronounced, Gwyn retained the genuine virtues that had made him a great leader. His dedication to his people remained absolute. His willingness to sacrifice for their benefit was unquestionable, and his vision of what the world could become continued to inspire those around him. This combination of noble intentions with flawed methods would define the final phase of Gwyn's reign and the ultimate tragedy of his sacrifice. He would make the greatest sacrifice possible in service of what he believed to be the greatest good, but his very devotion to that good would blind him to the harm his methods would cause. The Lord of Sunlight, who had brought light to a grey world, would end his reign by creating a system that consumed light itself, feeding the very thing he sought to preserve on the heroic souls that made preservation worthwhile. His love for the Age of Fire would become the instrument of its corruption. His desire to protect his people would become the mechanism of their exploitation. But before that ultimate tragedy could unfold, there would be many more years of glory and achievement, many more demonstrations of what divine leadership could accomplish when guided by wisdom and constrained by humility. The full flowering of Anor Londo was yet to come, and with it the final proof of both the promise and the limitations of power exercised without adequate understanding of its consequences. The Lord of Sunlight stood at the apex of his power, ruler of the greatest civilization the world had ever known, beloved by his people and feared by his enemies. Everything he had dreamed of during the dark days of the Dragon Wars had come to pass, and more besides. Yet in the depths of his magnificent city, in the quiet moments between the ceremonies and councils that filled his days, Gwyn found himself staring into the heart of the first flame and wondering how long its light would last. The question that would ultimately destroy him had already begun to form in his mind. What price would be too high to pay to keep that light burning forever? The answer to that question would reshape the world and condemn countless generations to suffer for his choices. But for now, the flame burned bright. Anor Londo gleamed in eternal sunlight, and the Lord of Sunlight continued his reign in the golden age he had created, and would one day sacrifice everything to preserve. Chapter 3. The Fading Flame. Time passed in Anor Londo as it did nowhere else, slowly, gently, like the turning of golden hours in an eternal afternoon. Yet even in that timeless city, change was inevitable. The first flame, source of all light and warmth in the world, began to show signs of the mortality that Gwyn had fought so hard to overcome. At first, the changes were subtle. The eternal sunlight that bathed Anor Londo would occasionally flicker, just for a moment, as if a cloud had passed before an unseen sun. The flames in the city's braziers would burn slightly lower, their light a fraction dimmer than it had been in years past. These variations were so minor that most inhabitants dismissed them as imagination or paid them no attention at all. But Gwyn noticed everything. His connection to the first flame was deeper than that of any other being, his Lord's soul intrinsically linked to the cosmic fire that had given birth to the Age of Fire. Through this connection, he could feel the flame's gradual weakening, like a man might feel his own heartbeat growing fainter. The realization that the flame was truly fading brought with it a cascade of terrible understanding. Everything Gwyn had built, everything he valued, everything that defined his world depended on that cosmic fire continuing to burn. Without it, the disparity that separated light from dark, life from death, heat from cold, would collapse back into the grey uniformity of the Age of Ancients. But worse than returning to the ancient stagnation was the prospect of what the flame's death might actually bring, the Age of Dark. This was not merely the absence of light, but a fundamental transformation that would elevate darkness over illumination, humanity over gods, change over preservation. The very beings Gwyn had marked with the dark sign, whom he had positioned as servants of his divine order, would become the rulers of whatever world emerged from his age's ashes. The thought filled him with a dread that went beyond mere fear of death or defeat. This was existential terror, the recognition that everything he believed to be good and right and necessary might be replaced by its opposite. His children would lose their divine status. His knights would find their service meaningless. His people would be abandoned to fend for themselves in a world ruled by forces they had been taught to fear. Gwyn's initial response to this crisis was to seek counsel from his fellow lords, hoping that together they might find a solution that would preserve the Age of Fire without requiring extreme measures. But the other bearers of Lord Souls had their own concerns and their own plans for addressing the fading flame. The Witch of Izalith, ever confident in her mastery of fire and life, proposed what seemed like an elegant solution. If the first flame was dying, why not create a new one? Using the power of her Lord's soul and the accumulated knowledge of her daughters, she would attempt to recreate the cosmic accident that had originally brought light to the world. Gwyn tried to dissuade her from this course, sensing that the forces involved were too complex and dangerous to be safely controlled. But the witch was determined, and her plan had a compelling logic that appealed to his desire for a solution that would not require sacrifice or compromise. The attempt was made in the depths of Izalith, where the witch and her daughters gathered around a great ritual flame and began the process of creation. For a moment, it seemed as though they might succeed. A new flame blazed to life, burning with power that rivaled the original first flame. But the new fire was wrong. Instead of the clear, life-giving flames that had marked the dawn of the Age of Fire, this new creation burned with chaotic intensity, consuming rather than creating, destroying rather than illuminating. The bed of chaos that emerged from the failed ritual spread its corrupting influence throughout Izalith, transforming the witch herself into a twisted tree-like creature and scattering her daughters across the earth as demons and monsters. The disaster at Izalith served as a harsh lesson about the limitations of power and the dangers of trying to recreate forces beyond mortal understanding. It also eliminated one of Gwyn's most important allies and created a new threat that would plague the world for ages to come. Nito, the Gravelord, offered no solutions to the fading flame crisis. His domain was death, and he seemed content to allow the natural cycle of ending and beginning to proceed as it would. This acceptance of inevitable change was perhaps the wisest response to the situation, but it offered no comfort to Gwyn, who could not bear the thought of allowing his age to die naturally. The furtive pygmy, as always, remained in the shadows, his thoughts and plans unknown. But his very existence represented the alternative that Gwyn feared most, the possibility that humanity would inherit the earth when the Age of Fire ended. With his fellow lords unable or unwilling to provide the solution he sought, Gwyn began to consider more desperate measures. The flame required fuel to burn, and the most potent fuel available was the power of the Lord's souls themselves. If he could sacrifice his own soul to the flame, he might be able to extend the Age of Fire for centuries or even millennia. The idea was both compelling and terrifying. On one hand, it offered a clear path to preserving everything he valued, ensuring that his children and his people would continue to live in the light he had brought to the world. On the other hand, it would require his own death and the complete sacrifice of his personal existence for the benefit of others. For a being of lesser character, such a choice might have been impossible to make. But Gwyn had spent his entire existence in service to ideals greater than himself. He had fought the dragons not for personal glory, but to free the world from stagnation. He had built Anor Londo not as a monument to his own power, but as a beacon of what divine civilization could achieve. The more he contemplated the sacrifice, the more inevitable it seemed. He was the greatest of the lords, the one whose soul burned brightest, and whose power was most closely aligned with the flame itself. If anyone could provide the fuel necessary to preserve the age, it was him. But Gwyn was also wise enough to understand that his sacrifice alone might not be sufficient. The flame would eventually weaken again, requiring additional fuel to maintain its burning. Unless he could create a system that would provide that fuel regularly and reliably, his sacrifice would only postpone the inevitable rather than preventing it. This recognition led him to develop the most ambitious and ultimately tragic plan of his long life. He would not simply sacrifice himself to preserve the Age of Fire. He would create a mechanism that would ensure the preservation could continue indefinitely, fueled by the willing sacrifice of heroes who would be guided to follow his example. The plan required careful preparation and the cooperation of allies who understood both its necessity and its cost. Chief among these was Kingseeker Frampt, one of the primordial serpents whose ancient wisdom and ability to travel between worlds made him an ideal agent for the complex manipulations that would be required. Working with Frampt, Gwyn began to construct a narrative that would guide future heroes toward the choice he was about to make himself. They crafted prophecies that spoke of chosen undead who would be called to link the fire, of bells that would awaken these heroes to their destiny, of trials that would test their worthiness for the ultimate sacrifice. The dark sign which Gwyn had originally created as a mark of human subservience to divine authority was repurposed as the mechanism that would identify and empower potential sacrifices. Those who bore it would become undead when they died, unable to find peace until they either lost their humanity entirely or found a purpose great enough to sustain them through their curse. Asylums were established to house these undead, ostensibly as places of mercy where the cursed could be protected from a world that feared them. In reality, these institutions served as testing grounds where potential heroes could be identified and evaluated for their suitability as future Lords of Cinder. The most promising candidates would be selected for liberation from their asylums, beginning journeys that would lead them through carefully orchestrated trials designed to strengthen their souls and prepare them for their ultimate fate. Every step of these journeys would be guided by Frampt and other agents of the system, though the heroes themselves would believe they were acting on their own initiative. The elegance of the plan lay in its use of humanity's own virtues against them. The courage, determination, and selflessness that made individuals worthy of heroic status also made them ideal candidates for manipulation and sacrifice. Their very nobility would blind them to the true nature of their quests, allowing them to walk willingly toward their own destruction while believing they were saving the world. To ensure the system's success, Gwyn also made provisions for his children and followers after his sacrifice. Gwyndolin, despite his affinity for darkness that had always troubled his father, would remain in Anor Londo to maintain the illusion of divine presence and guide heroes toward their fate. His mastery of illusion magic would allow him to create false images of his departed sister Guinevere, providing the maternal blessing that would encourage heroes to accept their destiny. The Silver Knights would remain as guardians of the empty city, their loyalty ensuring that the grand deception could be maintained across the centuries. The various religious orders that had grown up around Gwyn's teachings would spread the necessary prophecies and identify potential candidates for the cycle. Most importantly, the entire system would operate on the principle of informed consent, or rather, the careful management of information to ensure that consent appeared genuine while actually being manufactured. Heroes would believe they were making free choices based on complete knowledge, when in fact they were following predetermined paths based on carefully selected truths and strategic omissions. With his preparations complete, Gwyn faced the final decision of his long life. He could abandon his plans and allow the Age of Fire to end naturally, accepting that his time as a ruler was finished, and trusting that whatever came next would find its own path to wisdom and prosperity. Or he could proceed with his sacrifice, preserving his age at the cost of his own existence, and committing future generations to a cycle of heroic immolation. The choice revealed the fundamental flaw in Gwyn's character that had grown more pronounced as his fear of the flames fading intensified. Despite all his achievements and wisdom, he could not bring himself to trust in the possibility of beneficial change. The unknown future seemed more threatening than the certain present, even when preserving that present required methods that violated his own principles. His love for his age had become possessive rather than nurturing, concerned more with preventing loss than with enabling growth. Like a parent who refuses to allow their children to face the risks necessary for maturation, Gwyn chose to keep his world in a state of artificial childhood rather than allowing it to develop into whatever adult form it might naturally achieve. The decision to link the fire was thus both the most selfless and the most selfish act of Gwyn's existence. Selfless because it required the complete sacrifice of his personal being for the benefit of others. Selfish because it imposed his vision of what was best upon countless future generations who would be given no choice in the matter. On the day of the linking, Gwyn gathered his most loyal knights, the Black Knights who had served him since the Dragon Wars, and led them in a final march to the kiln of the First Flame. These warriors, who had followed him through every battle and shared in every triumph, would accompany him into death as they had accompanied him through life. The journey to the kiln was both solemn procession and funeral march. Gwyn knew he would never return, and his knights suspected the same. Yet none wavered in their loyalty, understanding that their lord's sacrifice was motivated by love for the world they had all sworn to protect. At the threshold of the kiln, Gwyn paused for a final moment to contemplate what he was about to do. Behind him lay the kingdom he had built, the family he would never see again, the age he had brought into being through his own will and power. Before him lay the dying flame that had made it all possible, flickering weakly in its cosmic hearth. The choice was no longer whether to proceed. That decision had been made long ago. The only question now was whether his sacrifice would prove sufficient to achieve its intended purpose. Whether the system he had created would function as designed, whether future heroes would prove willing to follow his example. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, stepped into the First Flame. The transformation was immediate and absolute. The fire that had seemed so weak and fading suddenly blazed with renewed vigor, fed by the power of the greatest Lord Soul ever to exist. The light that had begun to dim throughout the world returned in full strength, pushing back the encroaching darkness and preserving the Age of Fire for generations yet to come. But the cost was beyond anything Gwyn had anticipated. The flame did not simply consume his power, it consumed his very identity, burning away his consciousness while preserving just enough awareness to serve as a mindless guardian. His magnificent form was reduced to charred bone and sinew. His crown became a mockery of authority. His sword flickered with the weak flames of a dying fire. His knights, caught in the conflagration of his linking, were similarly transformed. Their bodies burned away, leaving only hollow suits of armor animated by the echoes of their former loyalty. They would wander the world as Black Knight phantoms, serving no purpose, but unable to find rest. The linking was successful in its immediate goal. The first flame burned bright once more, and the Age of Fire continued. But it had created something monstrous in the process, transforming the noblest sacrifice into the most degrading torment. Gwyn had given everything to preserve his age, only to discover that preservation required not just his death, but his eternal suffering. Thus began the cycle that would define the remaining centuries of the Age of Fire. Every few hundred years, as the flame weakened from feeding on Gwyn's diminishing essence, a new hero would be called to repeat his sacrifice. Each would believe themselves to be the first, the chosen one, the special individual destined to save the world. None would know that they were simply the latest link in a chain of sacrifice that stretched back through the centuries. The system worked exactly as Gwyn had designed it to work. Heroes rose, journeyed to the kiln, and fed themselves to the dying flame. The Age of Fire continued, sustained by the willing sacrifice of its greatest champions. The light endured, pushing back the darkness that threatened to engulf the world. But with each cycle, the true cost of this preservation became more apparent. The flame grew hungrier, requiring more frequent sacrifices to maintain its strength. The heroes who fed it possessed souls of diminishing power, providing less fuel for shorter periods. The very success of the system ensured its eventual failure, as it consumed the spiritual resources it needed to sustain itself. More tragically, the cycle corrupted the very heroism it exploited. What should have been the highest expression of human virtue, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others, became a grotesque parody of nobility, a suicide cult disguised as salvation. The heroes who should have been building a better world were instead burning themselves alive to preserve a world that grew more hollow with each passing age. The irony was profound and bitter. Gwyn's sacrifice, motivated by genuine love for his people and his world, had created a system that prevented both from growing and developing naturally. His attempt to preserve the best of the Age of Fire had instead created a machine that consumed the very qualities that made preservation worthwhile. Yet the system endured because it served the psychological needs of those who administered it as well as those who participated in it. For Gwyndolin and the other inheritors of Gwyn's legacy, the cycle provided meaning and purpose in a world that might otherwise seem empty and directionless. For the heroes who walked the path to the kiln, it offered the ultimate validation of their worth and the promise that their lives would have cosmic significance. The tragedy was not that people chose to participate in the cycle, but that they were never given the opportunity to make that choice freely and honestly. The elaborate deceptions that surrounded the linking ritual ensured that heroes acted on incomplete information, guided by manipulated emotions rather than clear understanding. This deception was perhaps Gwyn's greatest sin, not the sacrifice itself, which was genuinely motivated by love and concern for others, but the denial of genuine choice to those who would follow his path. In seeking to ensure that others would make the same decision he had made, he eliminated the very freedom and dignity that made such decisions meaningful. The fading flame had thus become not a crisis to be resolved, but a permanent condition to be managed through the systematic harvest of heroic souls. Gwyn's age would endure not through its own strength or wisdom, but through the endless consumption of those who might have renewed it through more natural means. The Lord of Sunlight had achieved his goal of preserving the Age of Fire, but in doing so, he had transformed it into something that was neither truly alive nor properly dead. His legacy would be measured not in the civilizations that flourished under his rule, but in the heroes who burned themselves to ash to keep his vision alive for a few more years. In the end, Gwyn's tragedy was not that he failed to save his world, but that he succeeded in ways that made saving it unnecessary and growth impossible. The fading flame that had threatened to end his age became instead its eternal torment, burning forever on the sacrifice of those who should have been its salvation. Chapter 4. The Cycle of Sacrifice. In the centuries following Gwyn's linking of the first flame, his carefully constructed system began to operate with the precision he had envisioned. Yet the reality of its function proved far more complex and tragic than even he might have anticipated. What was meant to be a temporary measure to preserve his age became a self-perpetuating machine that would define the character of the dying Age of Fire for 1,000 years. The first challenge faced by those who inherited Gwyn's system was the simple logistics of identification and recruitment. The dark sign that marked potential candidates appeared seemingly at random, affecting individuals across all levels of society without regard for their preparation or desire to serve. A farmer's son might find himself marked by the curse, thrust into undeath without any understanding of what his condition meant or what might be expected of him. The asylum system that Gwyn had established proved essential for managing this chaotic process. These massive institutions, scattered across the known world, served as collection points where the newly cursed could be housed, evaluated, and gradually prepared for their potential destiny. The official story presented them as charitable institutions, places of mercy where the unfortunate undead could find shelter and purpose. The reality was far more calculating. Each asylum was designed as a screening facility where the undead were observed and tested to determine their suitability for heroic service. Those who showed exceptional courage, determination, or spiritual strength were quietly marked for special attention. The rest were left to gradually lose their humanity in comfortable captivity, their slow decline serving both as a warning to the chosen few and as a source of tragic motivation for their quests. The Undead Asylum, where our own protagonist begins their journey, exemplified this process. Its inhabitants had been carefully selected and observed over years or even decades, with the most promising candidate being given the opportunity to escape when the time was right. The presence of the asylum demons served as both a final test and a way to ensure that only the most capable individual could leave to fulfill their destiny. Even the manner of escape was orchestrated with care. Oscar of Astora, himself a knight seeking his own purpose, arrived at precisely the right moment to provide the keys and encouragement needed for the breakout attempt. His words about prophecy and destiny were sincere, but they were also part of a larger script that had been repeated countless times before with countless other chosen souls. The path that led from the asylum inevitably brought heroes to Firelink's shrine, where Kingseeker Frampt waited to provide guidance and direction. The primordial serpent had perfected his role over the centuries, learning exactly how to present the linking quest in terms that would appeal to each individual hero's particular motivations and values. To some, he spoke of duty and honor, emphasizing their obligation to preserve the light against the encroaching darkness. To others, he appealed to compassion, describing the suffering that would result if the flame were allowed to die. Still others responded better to appeals to their pride, being told that they alone possessed the power to accomplish what lesser beings could not. Frampt's genius lay not in deception, but in selective emphasis. Everything he told the heroes was technically true. They were indeed chosen for a great purpose. Their sacrifice would indeed preserve the world as they knew it, and they did indeed possess the power to link the flame successfully. What he omitted were the less palatable truths: that they were not unique, that their sacrifice would only postpone rather than solve the underlying problem, and that alternatives to linking the fire did exist. The journey from Firelink Shrine to the kiln of the first flame was designed as both practical preparation and psychological conditioning. The trials that heroes faced, ringing the bells of awakening, obtaining the Lord Vessel, gathering the Lord Souls, served the dual purpose of strengthening their souls to provide better fuel for the flame, while also deepening their commitment to the quest through invested effort. Each challenge overcome made it harder for heroes to question whether their sacrifice was truly necessary. Having spent months or years working toward the goal of linking the fire, having overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and defeated legendary foes, they naturally became psychologically invested in seeing their quest through to completion. The other characters encountered along the way each served specific functions in this grand design. Some provided essential services: weapons, armor, spells, and items that enabled continued progress toward the goal. Others offered companionship and emotional support, preventing heroes from succumbing to despair before reaching the kiln. A few provided cautionary tales, showing what happened to those who failed in their purpose or attempted to resist the system. Solaire of Astora represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this psychological architecture. His cheerful demeanor and unwavering optimism made him an ideal companion for heroes struggling with the weight of their destiny. His own quest for his son served as both metaphor and motivation, showing that the search for purpose and meaning was worth any sacrifice. Yet Solaire himself might have been a victim of the same system he helped perpetuate. His fragmentary memories and mysterious origins suggested that he too had once been someone else, perhaps even one of the gods themselves, condemned to wander as an undead until he could prove himself worthy of redemption or find peace in service to others. The tragic irony of Solaire's situation was that his greatest virtue, his ability to inspire hope and determination in others, made him an unwitting agent of the very system that had destroyed his original identity. His sincere desire to help heroes achieve their goals served the machine that consumed heroes for fuel. Other characters throughout Lordran showed different aspects of the undead condition and the various paths available to those marked by the curse. The crestfallen warrior embodied the despair that threatened all who lost their sense of purpose, his bitter observations serving as both warning and counterpoint to the hope that Frampt preached. Sigmire of Katarina demonstrated the tragedy of good intentions corrupted by circumstances beyond one's control. His quest for adventure and purpose led him into increasingly dangerous situations, each one eroding his sense of self until he became a shadow of his former jovial nature. The merchants and craftsmen scattered throughout the land showed how some undead found meaning in service to others, maintaining their humanity through useful purpose. Yet even they were part of the system, enabling heroes to grow stronger and better equipped for their ultimate sacrifice. These supporting characters serve to illustrate that while many paths existed for the undead, all ultimately led to the same destination. Whether they burned in the flame, faded into hollowing, or simply disappeared into the vast emptiness of Lordran, each served the system in their own way. The genius of the cycle was that it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared to be a straightforward narrative of heroic sacrifice, chosen warriors rising to meet a cosmic crisis through their willingness to give everything for the greater good. This surface narrative was compelling and emotionally satisfying, providing heroes with a sense of purpose and meaning that sustained them through their trials. Beneath this heroic veneer lay a more complex reality of careful manipulation and systemic exploitation. The heroes were not responding to a genuine crisis, but to an artificially maintained emergency. Their sacrifice was not necessary for the world's survival, but only for the preservation of a particular configuration of power that had outlived its natural lifespan. At the deepest level, the cycle represented a profound philosophical error, the belief that preservation of the past was more important than growth toward the future. This error was understandable given Gwyn's experiences and the genuine beauty of what he sought to preserve. But it led to choices that violated the natural order of existence itself. The cumulative effect of these multiple layers was a system that was simultaneously noble and corrupt, inspiring and tragic, successful and catastrophic. Heroes could genuinely feel that they were doing something meaningful and important because on one level they were. But their noble sacrifice was being used to perpetuate a cosmic injustice that prevented the natural development of the world they sought to save. As the centuries passed and the cycle repeated itself again and again, certain patterns began to emerge. The flame grew progressively weaker with each linking, requiring more frequent sacrifices to maintain its strength. The heroes who answered the call possessed souls of diminishing power, as the most potent spiritual energies were gradually consumed by the system itself. This created a feedback loop that ensured the cycle's eventual breakdown. The weaker the flame became, the more often it needed to be rekindled. The more often it was rekindled, the faster it consumed the available supply of heroic souls. The faster it consumed heroic souls, the weaker each subsequent linking became. The mathematics of this decline were inexorable. What had begun as a sustainable system for preserving the Age of Fire gradually transformed into an increasingly desperate struggle to postpone its inevitable collapse. Each success became smaller and more temporary, requiring greater efforts for diminishing returns. Yet the system's administrators could not acknowledge this trajectory without admitting that their entire enterprise was doomed to failure. Instead, they doubled down on their efforts, seeking ways to make the process more efficient or to identify heroes with greater potential for sacrifice. This led to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for manipulation and control. The prophecies became more detailed and compelling, the trials more carefully designed to produce psychological commitment, the rewards more precisely calibrated to maintain motivation without satisfying it completely. Religious institutions played a crucial role in this escalation, developing elaborate theologies around the virtue of sacrifice and the necessity of preserving the light against the darkness. The Way of White became particularly important, spreading Gwyn's philosophy throughout human civilization and creating populations that were psychologically prepared to celebrate rather than question the heroic immolation of their greatest individuals. These religious teachings were not entirely false. The Age of Fire had indeed brought many benefits to the world, and its preservation did prevent certain forms of suffering and chaos, but they were selective in their emphasis, focusing on the positive aspects of the current order while ignoring its costs and refusing to seriously consider alternatives. The most sophisticated form of this religious propaganda was the development of martyrdom cults that specifically celebrated the heroes who had linked the fire. These cults created elaborate mythologies around figures like Gwyn himself, presenting their sacrifice as the ultimate expression of virtue and encouraging others to aspire to similar fates. By making heroic suicide into the highest form of religious devotion, these cults helped ensure a steady supply of candidates for the linking ritual. Young people grew up hearing stories of the great heroes who had given their lives to preserve the light, and naturally began to see such sacrifice as the pinnacle of achievement. This cultural conditioning was particularly effective because it operated through positive rather than negative reinforcement. Instead of threatening punishment for those who refused to participate in the system, it offered the promise of eternal glory for those who embraced it. Heroes walked to their deaths not from fear, but from hope, believing they were achieving the greatest possible validation of their worth. The tragedy of this approach was that it corrupted the very virtues it claimed to celebrate. Courage became recklessness, selflessness became self-destruction, and love became obsession. The qualities that made heroes worthy of admiration were transformed into weapons that could be used against them. Yet the system's success in producing willing sacrifices was also the source of its eventual downfall. By consuming the very individuals who might have found alternative solutions to the flame's decline, it eliminated the possibility of genuine innovation or fundamental change. Each hero who died to preserve the status quo was one less person who might have discovered a way to transcend it. This created an increasingly desperate situation where the only solution to the system's problems lay in more aggressive application of the same methods that had created those problems in the first place. The cycle became not just self-perpetuating, but self-accelerating, consuming resources at an ever-increasing rate while providing diminishing benefits. The few voices that spoke against this trajectory were marginalized or suppressed. Scholars who documented the cycle's failures were accused of undermining morale. Heroes who questioned their destiny were branded as cowards or traitors. Even failed Lords of Cinder, who tried to warn their successors, were dismissed as bitter failures whose opinions could be safely ignored. This suppression of dissent was maintained not primarily through force, but through the deep psychological conditioning that made questioning the system feel like betraying everything sacred and meaningful. To reject the cycle of linking was to reject the sacrifices of all who had come before, to declare that their suffering had been meaningless. Yet despite this overwhelming pressure for conformity, doubts persisted and gradually accumulated. Each obvious manipulation, each revelation of the system's true nature, each encounter with the hollow remnants of previous heroes added weight to the growing understanding that something was fundamentally wrong with the established order. The process was slow and often painful, as individuals struggled to reconcile their trained beliefs with the evidence of their own experience. Many who began to question the system eventually retreated into comfortable delusions rather than face the full implications of their doubts. But some persisted in their questioning, gradually building an alternative understanding based on careful observation rather than inherited doctrine. These individuals, characters like Darkstalker Carthy, certain failed lords who became teachers rather than obstacles, scholars who preserved dangerous knowledge, slowly accumulated the foundation of resistance that would eventually make genuine choice possible. The cycle of sacrifice that Gwyn had created to preserve his age thus contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. By producing heroes with the power to see through deception and the courage to act on their understanding, it eventually generated the very agents who could challenge its authority and offer alternatives to its demands. This irony was perhaps the most fitting aspect of the entire system, that the mechanism designed to prevent change would ultimately create the conditions necessary for the most fundamental change of all. The cycle that began with Gwyn's fear of the unknown future would end with heroes brave enough to embrace that future, despite all the accumulated pressure to preserve the familiar past. Chapter 5. The Hollow Crown. Within the heart of the kiln of the first flame, where cosmic forces burn in eternal struggle against entropy, sits the remnant of what was once the greatest of the lords. Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, bears little resemblance to the magnificent god who once wielded lightning against dragons, or the wise king who built Anor Londo. He has become something far more tragic, a hollow shell of his former self, mindlessly guarding the flame he died to preserve. The transformation that Gwyn underwent when he linked the first flame was more profound and terrible than even he had anticipated. He had expected to die in service to his cause, to sacrifice his life so that his age might continue. What he discovered was that the flame required not just his death, but his eternal suffering. The linking process did not simply consume his soul. It bound him to the fire itself, making him part of its structure while preserving just enough consciousness to experience every moment of his endless burning. For 1,000 years, Gwyn has existed in this state of agonizing limbo. His body, once radiant with divine power, has been reduced to charred bone and withered flesh. His crown, symbol of his authority over the greatest civilization the world had ever known, has become a mockery of rulership. His great sword, which once channeled the very power of sunlight, now flickers with the weak flames of a dying fire. Yet, despite this physical degradation, enough of Gwyn's essence remains to fulfill his appointed function. He sits upon his throne of ash, a mindless guardian whose only purpose is to prevent others from interfering with the flame he has become part of. His awareness has been reduced to a single, overriding imperative: protect the fire, no matter the cost. The irony of this situation is profound and heartbreaking. Heroes who arrive at the kiln believing they are following in Gwyn's footsteps, seeking to emulate his noble sacrifice, must first destroy what remains of him. They are forced to kill their inspiration, to literally fight through the consequences of the choice they're about to make themselves. This battle serves multiple cruel purposes within the system that Gwyn had established. On a practical level, it ensures that only the strongest heroes can reach the flame, guaranteeing that their souls will provide substantial fuel for the linking process. Weak or unprepared individuals will be destroyed by Gwyn's hollow form, their inadequate souls spared from the futile gesture of an insufficient sacrifice. On a psychological level, the battle serves as a final test of the hero's commitment to their cause. Faced with the living proof of what linking the fire actually entails, not glorious martyrdom, but endless, mindless suffering, heroes must choose whether to proceed with their sacrifice or seek alternatives. Those who falter at this crucial moment reveal that their dedication was insufficient to sustain them through the trials that await. But perhaps most tragically, the battle represents the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Age of Fire's artificial extension. Every hero who seeks to preserve Gwyn's legacy must first destroy Gwyn himself. Every attempt to honor his sacrifice requires his symbolic defeat. The system he created to ensure the continuation of his age demands the endless repetition of his destruction. Gwyn's hollow form fights with a shadow of his former skill, wielding techniques that once made him the greatest warrior among the gods. His lightning, though diminished, still carries echoes of the bolts that stripped the scales from ancient dragons. His swordplay, though mechanical, still reflects the martial prowess that had made him legendary among his followers. Yet there is something profoundly sorrowful about these displays of former glory. Each attack he makes is perfect in its execution, but empty of the passion and purpose that had once driven him. He fights because he must, not because he chooses to. His movements follow patterns established over millennia of hollow repetition, muscle memory preserved long after the mind that guided it has been consumed by flame. The heroes who face him often report a sense of profound melancholy during the battle, as if they were not fighting an enemy, but performing a mercy killing. Some describe hearing faint echoes of Gwyn's former voice in the crackle of flames, pleading for release from his eternal torment. Others claim to see glimpses of his original noble bearing in moments between attacks, when the hollow mask slips enough to reveal the god trapped within. These encounters with Gwyn's residual humanity make the battle emotionally devastating for many heroes. They realize they are not fighting a monster or an obstacle, but a victim of the very system they are seeking to perpetuate. The choice to link the fire becomes not just a decision about their own fate, but a choice about whether to subject themselves to the same eternal suffering they have just witnessed. Some heroes, overwhelmed by this revelation, choose to end their quest at this point. Having defeated Gwyn, they walk away from the flame, allowing it to die naturally rather than feeding it their own soul. These individuals often speak of feeling that they have already completed their true purpose, not in linking the fire, but in freeing Gwyn from his 1,000-year torment. Others find their resolve strengthened by the encounter. Seeing the price that Gwyn paid for his commitment to preserving the Age of Fire, they feel obligated to honor his sacrifice by making the same choice themselves. They view his suffering as proof that the flame is worth any cost, that the preservation of light and warmth justifies even eternal torment. The most tragic response comes from those heroes who recognize the full horror of Gwyn's situation, but convince themselves that they can somehow do better. These individuals proceed with the linking ritual, believing that their stronger will or greater wisdom will allow them to avoid Gwyn's fate, that they can feed the flame without becoming its prisoner. This delusion rarely survives the actual process of linking. The flame's hunger is not discriminating. It consumes all who offer themselves to it with equal thoroughness. The heroes who believed they could maintain their consciousness and dignity while serving as fuel discover too late that the fire cares nothing for their intentions or their noble nature. The transformation from hero to hollow guardian follows a predictable pattern, though the specific details vary depending on the individual's personality and the strength of their soul. Initially, the newly linked Lord of Cinder retains most of their original awareness, experiencing the burning as intense but bearable pain. They may even feel a sense of accomplishment, believing they have successfully preserved the age through their sacrifice. But as the flame feeds on their essence, consuming not just their power, but their memories and emotions, the new Lord begins to understand the true nature of their situation. They realize that they are not heroes who have completed a noble quest, but prisoners who have walked willingly into an eternal jail. The knowledge that they chose this fate often makes the suffering worse, adding psychological torment to the physical agony of endless burning. As more of their soul is consumed, the Lord's ability to think clearly diminishes. Complex thoughts become difficult, then impossible. Emotions fade into dim echoes of their former intensity. Memories blur together until past and present become indistinguishable. Eventually, nothing remains but the basic imperative to guard the flame and the automatic responses necessary to fulfill that function. This process typically takes decades or centuries, depending on the strength of the soul involved and the flame's current level of hunger. Throughout this degradation, the Lord remains conscious enough to understand what is happening to them, but powerless to prevent it. They watch themselves becoming less human with each passing day, experiencing their own transformation into a hollow guardian as a form of slow-motion nightmare. The psychological impact of this experience cannot be overstated. Imagine being fully aware that your personality, your memories, everything that makes you who you are, is being slowly eaten away by an insatiable fire, and that this process will continue for eternity. Imagine knowing that you chose this fate because you believed you were saving the world. Some lords attempt to resist the process, fighting to maintain their consciousness and humanity, even as the flame consumes them. These struggles are always futile. The fire cannot be denied what it requires to burn, but they can prolong the suffering by drawing out the transformation over longer periods. Others try to accelerate their own dissolution, hoping to reach the merciful oblivion of complete hollowing as quickly as possible. But the flame has its own rhythm, its own needs, and it will not be hurried in its consumption. The Lord must endure every stage of the transformation, experiencing each loss of faculty as a separate tragedy. The few lords who retain enough awareness to contemplate their situation often develop elaborate philosophical frameworks to justify or explain their suffering. Some convince themselves that their torment serves a greater good, that their pain prevents worse suffering for others. Others embrace nihilistic acceptance, concluding that existence is inherently meaningless, and that one form of suffering is no worse than any other. The most dangerous are those who develop messiah complexes, believing that their sacrifice grants them special insight or authority over the fate of the world. These lords may attempt to influence events beyond the kiln, using what little power they retain to manipulate heroes or interfere with the natural progression of ages. But regardless of their philosophical adaptations, all Lords of Cinder eventually reach the same destination: complete hollowing and reduction to mindless guardians. The fire takes what it needs, and what it needs is everything. No amount of will, wisdom, or noble intention can change this fundamental truth. Gwyn's particular tragedy lies in the fact that he was the first to experience this transformation, the prototype for all who would follow. He had no warning of what linking the fire actually entailed, no previous example to learn from. He made his choice based on his fears about the Age of Dark and his determination to preserve his age, never imagining that preservation would require his eternal suffering. His followers, who witnessed his transformation and understood its true cost, made the deliberate choice to perpetuate the system he had created. They knew that every hero they guided to the kiln would suffer the same fate as their former lord, but they convinced themselves that this cost was justified by the benefits of maintaining the Age of Fire. This knowledge makes their actions even more morally complex than Gwyn's original decision. Where Gwyn acted out of ignorance and fear, his followers acted with full awareness of the consequences. They chose to create a system that would generate endless suffering because they believed the alternative, the natural end of the Age of Fire, was worse. The question of whether they were right remains one of the most debated aspects of Dark Souls lore. Was the Age of Dark truly the catastrophe that Gwyn and his followers believed it would be? Would humanity have been better served by allowing the natural cycle to proceed, even if it meant the end of the gods' rule and the fundamental transformation of the world? The evidence suggests that Gwyn's fears were largely unfounded. The Age of Dark would not have been an age of evil or destruction, but simply a different phase in the natural cycle of existence. Humanity, as inheritors of the Dark Soul, would have been the primary beneficiaries of such an age. But this does not necessarily mean that other forms of life would have suffered. The Abyss, which Gwyn and his followers often pointed to as evidence of the Dark's corrupting influence, was not a natural expression of the Dark Soul, but a perversion created by the very attempts to suppress and control it. By fighting against the natural order, Gwyn and his allies created the very disasters they sought to prevent. This makes Gwyn's hollow existence even more tragic. He suffers eternally not to prevent genuine catastrophe, but to maintain an artificial state that was never meant to last. His sacrifice preserves nothing of real value while causing immense suffering to countless souls across multiple ages. The crown that still sits upon his charred skull serves as a symbol of this futile achievement. Once a mark of legitimate authority and divine right, it has become a mockery of rulership, the ornament of a king who rules over nothing but ash and flame. The power it represents is the power to suffer forever in service of a cause that was never worthy of such devotion. Yet there is also something admirable in Gwyn's commitment, even if that commitment was misguided. He believed he was saving the world, and he was willing to pay any price to achieve that goal. His willingness to sacrifice everything he valued, his power, his family, his very existence, demonstrates a form of selflessness that is both noble and terrifying. This duality makes Gwyn one of the most complex figures in the Dark Souls universe. He is simultaneously hero and villain, savior and destroyer, noble sacrifice and cautionary tale. His choices created immense suffering, but they also preserved much that was beautiful and valuable about the Age of Fire. His methods were morally questionable, but his intentions were admirable. The hollow crown he wears represents this complexity. It is both a symbol of fallen greatness and a reminder of the costs of absolute commitment to any cause. It warns against the dangers of believing too strongly in one's own righteousness. while also honoring the courage required to make difficult choices in impossible circumstances. For the heroes who face him in the kiln, Gwyn serves as both inspiration and warning. His example shows what total dedication to a cause can achieve, but it also reveals the price that such dedication exacts. Heroes must decide not just whether they are willing to link the fire, but whether they are willing to become what Gwyn has become. Some find the prospect terrifying and choose to seek alternatives to the cycle of sacrifice. Others find it inspiring and embrace the opportunity to join the ranks of those who have given everything for the greater good. Still others see it as simply the natural conclusion of their heroic journey, no more significant than any other form of death. The battle with Gwyn forces heroes to confront these questions in the most immediate and personal way possible. They cannot simply philosophize about sacrifice and duty. They must literally fight through the consequences of such choices, experiencing firsthand what their own commitment might cost them. This confrontation with ultimate consequences is perhaps the most valuable aspect of Gwyn's continued existence. His hollow form serves as a mirror, reflecting back to each hero their own potential future. In fighting him, they fight not just an obstacle, but a version of themselves, the version that chooses duty over self-preservation, cause over comfort, abstract principles over personal happiness. The outcome of this internal battle often determines the hero's ultimate choice about linking the fire. Those who see Gwyn's fate as a noble sacrifice worthy of emulation will likely choose to join him in eternal service to the flame. Those who see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind devotion will likely seek other paths. But regardless of their ultimate choice, all heroes who reach the kiln are forced to grapple with the fundamental questions that Gwyn's existence raises. What causes are worth eternal suffering? What prices are too high to pay, even for the greatest goods? When does noble sacrifice become pointless martyrdom? These questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps why they continue to resonate across the centuries of the Age of Fire. Each generation of heroes must answer them anew, based on their own understanding of the world and their own values. The hollow crown reminds them that their predecessors have faced the same choices and that the consequences of those choices echo across the ages. In the end, Gwyn's transformation from mighty lord to hollow guardian represents the ultimate expression of the Age of Fire's central tragedy. An age that began with the promise of bringing light and meaning to the world, instead created a system that consumed meaning and reduced its greatest heroes to mindless automatons. The crown that was once a symbol of enlightened rule became the mark of a prisoner, worn by one who had sacrificed not just his life, but his very capacity for thought and feeling. The light that was meant to illuminate the world instead became a fire that consumed everything fed to it, leaving only ash and hollow echoes of former glory. Yet even in this tragic state, Gwyn serves a purpose. His existence reminds all who encounter him that no cause, however noble, is worth the complete sacrifice of one's humanity. His hollow crown teaches that true leadership requires not the willingness to burn oneself away in service of an ideal, but the wisdom to recognize when ideals have become destructive obsessions. The heroes who learn this lesson may find ways to break the cycle that has trapped their world for so long. Those who fail to learn it may find themselves wearing their own hollow crowns, sitting on their own thrones of ash, guarding flames that should have been allowed to die long ago. Thus, the hollow crown becomes both warning and opportunity, a symbol of what happens when noble intentions are pursued through ignoble means, but also a chance for each new generation to choose differently, to find ways of preserving what is valuable without sacrificing what is essential. In his mindless vigil, Gwyn continues to serve his people, not by protecting the flame that has consumed him, but by teaching through his own tragic example that some prices are too high to pay, even for the most sacred causes. The greatest service he can now provide is to show others what he has become, so that they might choose more wisely than he did in his moment of ultimate decision. Chapter 6. The Chosen Undead. After 1,000 years of cycles, of heroes rising and falling, of flames kindled and briefly sustained only to fade again, the system that Gwyn created finally reached its breaking point. The flame had grown so weak that even successful linkings provided only temporary relief, sometimes lasting mere years instead of centuries. The pool of potential heroes was dwindling as knowledge of the cycle's true nature spread throughout Lord Gwyn. Most crucially, the very structure of reality had become so distorted by the artificial extension of the Age of Fire that fundamental change was no longer optional, it was inevitable. Into this desperate situation came one final hero, known simply as the Chosen Undead. Like so many before them, they began their journey in the Undead Asylum, marked by the dark sign and guided by the familiar voices promising destiny and purpose. They escaped their cell, defeated the asylum demon, and received the traditional prophecy from the dying Oscar of Astora. Ring the bells of awakening, obtain the Lord vessel, gather the Lord's souls, and link the fire to save the world. But this hero's journey would be different from all those that had come before, not because of any special power or unique destiny, but because they arrived at a moment when the accumulated contradictions of Gwyn's system could no longer be contained. The very success of the cycle in producing willing sacrifices had also created the conditions for its own examination and potential rejection. The Chosen Undead encountered more than the usual complement of wise mentors and helpful allies. They also met the failed lords who had walked this path before, the cynical observers who had watched countless heroes march to their doom, and most significantly, they encountered Darkstalker Carter, the primordial serpent who offered an alternative to the endless cycle of sacrifice. Carthy's revelation was simple but devastating. The Age of Fire was not natural, the cycle of linking was not necessary, and the Age of Dark that Gwyn feared was not an apocalypse, but simply the next phase in the world's natural development. Humanity, as inheritors of the Dark Soul, were not servants of the gods, but their equals, potentially their superiors in the age that was meant to come. This knowledge transformed the Chosen Undead's journey from a straightforward heroic quest into a complex moral choice. They could follow the traditional path, gathering the Lord's souls and linking the fire as so many had done before. Or they could choose to let the flame die naturally, ushering in the Age of Dark and ending the 1,000-year cycle of artificial preservation. The choice was made even more complex by the revelation that both paths had been orchestrated by primordial serpents with their own agendas. Frampt sought to preserve the Age of Fire through continued sacrifice, while Carter worked to end it by preventing further linkings. Neither serpent was entirely trustworthy, and both had their own reasons for wanting to influence the Chosen Undead's decision. This manipulation raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of choice itself. If both options had been planned and prepared for by ancient powers, was the Chosen Undead truly making a free decision? Or were they simply selecting between predetermined alternatives, playing out the final act of a drama written long before their birth? The answer perhaps lay not in the serpent's machinations, but in the Chosen Undead's unique position as someone who had experienced the full truth of both options. Unlike previous heroes, who had been kept ignorant of alternatives to linking the fire, this final champion could make an informed decision based on complete knowledge of the consequences. This knowledge was hard-won and painful to acquire. The Chosen Undead witnessed firsthand the suffering of those marked by the dark sign, the desperation of a world locked in artificial stasis, and the hollow remains of heroes who had sacrificed everything for a cause that consumed them completely. They saw Anor Londo revealed as an illusion, Gwyn reduced to a mindless guardian, and the entire structure of divine authority exposed as elaborate theatre designed to perpetuate a cosmic lie. But they also experienced the genuine beauty and value that the Age of Fire had created. They walked through the magnificent halls of Anor Londo in its illusory prime, witnessed the devotion of the Silver Knights who still served their absent goddess, and met individuals like Solaire, whose optimism and hope seemed to justify the entire world they inhabited. The choice between preserving and ending the Age of Fire was not a simple matter of good versus evil, but a complex weighing of competing values and uncertain futures. Linking the fire would perpetuate suffering, but also preserve beauty. Letting it die would end the cycle of sacrifice, but might destroy much that was worth saving. The chosen undead's ultimate decision, whether to link the fire or walk away from it, would depend on their interpretation of this evidence and their judgment about which values were most important. Both choices carried profound consequences, not just for themselves, but for the entire world. If they chose to link the fire, they would become the next Lord of Cinder, burning away their consciousness and humanity to fuel a few more years of artificial light. They would join Gwyn in his eternal vigil, serving as a mindless guardian for heroes yet to come. The Age of Fire would continue, but at the same cost it had always demanded: the endless consumption of noble souls. This choice represented continuity and stability, the preservation of the known world even at the cost of perpetual sacrifice. It honored the dedication of those who had come before, while accepting the necessity of those who would come after. It was the choice of someone who believed that the current order, however flawed, was preferable to the uncertainty of fundamental change. If they chose to walk away from the flame, they would become the Dark Lord, ruler of an age of dark that would fundamentally transform the world. Humanity would inherit the earth that had been shaped by gods, but that inheritance would come with unknown challenges and responsibilities. The old order would end, but what would replace it remained uncertain. This choice represented change and possibility, the rejection of artificial preservation in favor of natural development. It honored the potential of humanity while accepting the loss of divine guidance and protection. It was the choice of someone who believed that growth required risk, that stagnation was worse than uncertainty. Both choices were acts of immense courage, requiring the hero to accept responsibility for consequences they could not fully predict or control. Neither was obviously correct, and both involved sacrificing some values to preserve others. The genius of the chosen undead situation was that it forced them to confront these choices without the comfort of predetermined answers. They could not rely on prophecy or divine guidance to tell them what was right. They had to decide for themselves based on their own understanding and values. This burden of genuine choice was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in 1,000 years, the fate of the world would be determined not by manipulation or deception, but by an individual's honest assessment of competing alternatives. The chosen undead would succeed or fail based on the quality of their judgment, not the strength of their arm or the purity of their intentions. The battle with Gwyn took on special significance in this context. It was not just a test of worthiness or a final obstacle to overcome, but a confrontation with the ultimate consequences of the choice the hero was about to make. In defeating Gwyn's hollow form, they were either freeing him from his eternal torment or preparing to join him in it. The fight itself was deeply symbolic, representing the hero's struggle with the legacy of the past and their decision about the future. Gwyn's desperate, mechanical attacks reflected the mindless momentum of a system that had outlived its purpose. The hero's ability to overcome these attacks demonstrated their power to to break free from predetermined patterns and forge new paths. Yet the battle also showed the terrible cost of such freedom. Gwyn had once been everything the hero aspired to be: powerful, noble, dedicated to protecting his people and preserving what he valued most. His transformation into a hollow guardian revealed what could happen to anyone who chose to sacrifice themselves for abstract principles rather than immediate realities. The moment of choice, standing before the first flame with Gwyn's essence freshly defeated, represented the culmination of not just the chosen undead's personal journey, but the entire 1,000-year history of the Age of Fire. Every hero who had walked this path, every manipulation and deception that had guided them here, every tragedy and triumph of the long cycle of linking, all of it led to this single decision. In a sense, the chosen undead was not just choosing for themselves, but for everyone who had come before and everyone who might come after. Their decision would validate or condemn the sacrifices of previous heroes. It would determine whether the suffering of ages had served a purpose or been entirely wasteful. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time since Gwyn's original sacrifice, someone with the power to determine the world's fate was in a position to make that determination based on complete information and genuine choice, rather than manipulation and deception. Whatever the chosen undead decided, their choice would be authentic in a way that no decision had been for 1,000 years. They could link the fire knowing exactly what it would cost them and why that cost might be worth paying. Or they could reject the flame knowing exactly what they were giving up and what they hoped to achieve instead. This authenticity was perhaps more important than the specific choice itself. The Age of Fire had been corrupted not just by its artificial extension, but by the deception and manipulation required to maintain it. Even if the chosen undead chose to link the fire, they would do so honestly, without the lies and half-truths that had characterized the previous cycle. If they chose to become the Dark Lord, they would embrace that role with full knowledge of its implications, rather than stumbling into it through ignorance or accident. Their rule would begin with transparency rather than deception, with choice rather than compulsion. The chosen undead's decision also represented a choice between competing visions of heroism. The traditional path of linking the fire embodied a heroism of sacrifice, where the greatest good was achieved through the total surrender of self for the benefit of others. This was the heroism that Gwyn had exemplified, the willingness to pay any price for the preservation of what one valued most. The alternative path embodied a heroism of transformation, where the greatest good was achieved through the courage to embrace change and uncertainty. This was a newer form of heroism, one that valued growth over preservation and potential over security. Neither form was inherently superior to the other, but they represented fundamentally different approaches to the relationship between individual and society, present and future, known and unknown. The chosen undead's choice between them would reflect their own deepest values and their assessment of what the world most needed. The moment of decision was made even more poignant by the setting in which it occurred. The kiln of the first flame was both the birthplace of the current age and potentially its graveyard. The very fire that had brought disparity and meaning to the grey world of the ancient dragons might soon be extinguished forever, or it might be fed once more to burn for a few additional years. Standing in that sacred space, surrounded by the ashes of previous heroes and the echoes of ancient choices, the chosen undead could feel the weight of history pressing down upon them. Every decision that had led to this moment, Gwyn's original fear of the dark, his manipulation of humanity, his desperate sacrifice to preserve his age, had created the circumstances that made their choice both necessary and possible. Yet for all the historical forces that had shaped their situation, The final decision remained theirs alone. No prophecy could dictate their choice. No manipulation could force their hand. They stood as a free agent in a cosmos that had forgotten what freedom meant, empowered to break cycles that had seemed eternal. The irony of this situation was that the very system designed to prevent meaningful choice had ultimately created the conditions necessary for the most meaningful choice of all. By preserving heroes who might otherwise have been consumed by their sacrifice, by allowing knowledge of alternatives to spread, by creating contradictions that could not be indefinitely sustained, Gwyn's system had generated its own opposition. The chosen undead represented not just an individual making a personal decision, but the emergence of genuine choice in a world that had been shaped by fear and control. Their decision would determine not just the immediate fate of the flame, but whether future generations would inherit a world shaped by honest choice or continued manipulation. In this sense, the chosen undead's greatest achievement was not their victory over any particular enemy or their success in any specific quest, but their restoration of meaningful choice to a world that had forgotten what choice meant. Whether they linked the fire or rejected it, they would do so as a free agent, making an informed decision, not as a manipulated pawn following predetermined patterns. This restoration of choice was perhaps the most valuable gift they could offer to the world, more precious than the preservation of any particular age or the prevention of any specific catastrophe. By choosing freely, they would demonstrate that such choice was possible, creating a precedent that could inspire future generations to claim their own freedom rather than accepting the choices made for them by others. The chosen undead's legacy would thus extend beyond their immediate decision about the flame. They would be remembered not just as the hero who ended or extended the Age of Fire, but as the one who proved that even the most deeply entrenched systems could be challenged, that even the most ancient patterns could be broken, that even the most fundamental assumptions could be questioned. In a world that had been shaped by one individual's refusal to accept change, the chosen undead offered the possibility of change embraced freely and courageously. Their choice would echo through whatever age followed, serving as proof that the future belonged not to the manipulation of the powerful, but to the authentic decisions of those brave enough to make them. Whether that future would be bright or dark, hopeful or tragic, remained to be seen. But it would be genuine in a way that no future had been for 1,000 years, shaped by choice rather than compulsion, by hope rather than fear, by the courage to embrace uncertainty, rather than the desperation to preserve the familiar at any cost. Chapter 7. The Fading Light. As our journey through the complete tragedy of Gwyn's sacrifice draws to its conclusion, we must consider the broader implications of the choices made across the millennia of the Age of Fire. Whether the chosen undead ultimately decided to link the flame or let it die, their decision marked the end of an era defined not by its achievements, but by its fundamental inability to accept the natural order of change and growth. The Age of Fire, which began with such promise as the first flame brought light and meaning to a grey world, had devolved into a self-perpetuating machine of suffering. What Gwyn had intended as a one-time sacrifice to preserve his golden age became an endless cycle that consumed the very values it claimed to protect. The light that was meant to illuminate became a fire that devoured everything fed to it, leaving only ash and the hollow echoes of former glory. Throughout this long decline, the signs of the age's corruption became increasingly evident to those willing to see them. The undead curse spread like a plague, marking more and more souls for potential sacrifice while trapping them in a limbo between life and death. The gods fled their own kingdom, leaving behind only illusions and empty promises. Reality itself began to break down under the strain of artificial preservation, with time becoming distorted and space folding in on itself. Yet even as these signs accumulated, the system that Gwyn had created proved remarkably resilient. Each crisis was met with new adaptations, new justifications, new methods of maintaining the cycle. When individual heroes proved insufficient, group sacrifices were arranged. When knowledge of the truth began to spread, more elaborate deceptions were crafted. When the flame grew too weak to accept offerings reliably, the frequency of attempts was increased. This adaptability was both the system's greatest strength and its ultimate weakness. By constantly evolving to meet new challenges, it survived far longer than should have been possible. But each adaptation also moved it further from its original purpose, transforming what had begun as a noble sacrifice into an increasingly grotesque parody of heroism. The priests and serpents who maintained the cycle convinced themselves that they were preserving something precious and irreplaceable. They spoke of the beauty of Anor Londo, the wisdom of the gods, the importance of maintaining the light against the encroaching darkness. But what they were actually preserving was their own power and relevance in a world that had grown beyond the need for their guidance. The true tragedy of the Age of Fire was not that it ended, all ages must end, but that it was artificially extended far beyond its natural lifespan. Like a terminal patient kept alive through increasingly invasive medical interventions, the age lingered in a state that could hardly be called life, sustained only through the constant infusion of new souls to replace those that had been consumed. This artificial preservation prevented the natural development that should have occurred when the Age of Fire reached its appointed end. The Age of Dark that Gwyn feared was not a catastrophe, but a necessary phase in the world's growth, a time when humanity would take its rightful place as the inheritors of the earth their ancestors had helped to shape. By preventing this transition, Gwyn and his followers created a world trapped in perpetual adolescence, never allowed to mature into what it was meant to become. The humans, who should have grown into their full potential as the children of the Dark Soul, remained servants and sacrifices. The natural cycle of death and rebirth that governed all existence was disrupted, creating the anomalies and contradictions that plagued Lord Gwyn. Even the beauty that the system claimed to preserve was corrupted by the means used to maintain it. Anor Londo's eternal sunlight became a lie told to convince heroes to die for an illusion. The knight's noble service became complicity in a vast deception. The gods' wisdom became manipulation designed to perpetuate their own relevance. The most profound corruption was the transformation of heroism itself from a virtue that served others into a vice that served the system. Heroes were no longer individuals who risked themselves to protect the innocent, but products manufactured to feed an insatiable fire. Their courage and nobility became tools used against them, weapons in the system's arsenal for maintaining its own existence. This perversion of heroism was perhaps the Age of Fire's greatest crime against the future. By teaching that the highest form of virtue was self-destruction in service of abstract principles, it created a culture that valued sacrifice over achievement, death over life, preservation over growth. Future generations would inherit this distorted understanding of heroism, potentially repeating the same mistakes in different forms. The psychological damage inflicted by the cycle of linking extended beyond individual heroes to entire civilizations. Kingdoms learned to measure their worth by their ability to produce candidates for sacrifice. Families took pride in children who showed the potential to become lords of Cinder. Religious institutions developed elaborate theologies around the virtue of self-destruction. This cultural conditioning created populations that were psychologically prepared to accept and even celebrate the waste of their greatest individuals. Instead of nurturing heroes to achieve great works and build better societies, these civilizations groomed them for consumption by an insatiable flame. The result was a systematic impoverishment of human potential across multiple generations. The economic impact was equally devastating. Resources that could have been used to improve living conditions, advance knowledge, or explore new possibilities, were instead devoted to maintaining the infrastructure of sacrifice. Entire industries developed around identifying, training, and transporting potential Lords of Cinder. The most talented individuals were removed from productive activities and channeled toward destruction. This misallocation of human resources created artificial scarcity and stunted development. Technologies that might have been discovered remained unknown. Arts that might have flourished were never explored. Social innovations that could have reduced suffering were never attempted. The Age of Fire's preservation came at the cost of countless unrealized possibilities. Perhaps most tragically, the system created its own justification through the very problems it caused. The undead curse, the reality distortions, the social instability. All of these were consequences of artificially extending the Age of Fire. But they were also used as evidence that the Age of Dark must be prevented at all costs. The worse conditions became, the more necessary the cycle of linking appeared to be. This created a self-reinforcing delusion that made rational evaluation of alternatives nearly impossible. Those who questioned the system could be dismissed as naive or corrupted by dark influences. The suffering caused by the cycle was attributed to external threats rather than systemic flaws. Each crisis was met with calls for greater dedication to the established order rather than consideration of fundamental changes. The few voices that spoke against this consensus were marginalized or suppressed. Scholars who documented the cycle's failures were accused of heresy. Heroes who refused to link the fire were branded as traitors. Even the failed lords who tried to warn their successors were dismissed as bitter failures whose opinions could be safely ignored. This suppression of dissent was not primarily enforced through violence, though that occurred as well. More often, it was maintained through social pressure and the deep psychological conditioning that made questioning the system feel like betraying everything sacred and meaningful. To reject the cycle of linking was to reject the sacrifices of all who had come before, to declare that their suffering had been meaningless. Yet despite this overwhelming pressure for conformity, doubts persisted and gradually accumulated. Each failed linking, each obvious manipulation, each revelation of the system's true nature added weight to the growing understanding that something was fundamentally wrong with the established order. The process was slow and often painful, as individuals struggled to reconcile their trained beliefs with the evidence of their own experience. Many who began to question the system eventually retreated into comfortable delusions rather than face the full implications of their doubts. Others became cynical observers who understood the truth but felt powerless to change it. A few, however, found the courage to act on their understanding. These individuals, characters like Carter, the failed lords who became teachers rather than obstacles, the scholars who preserved dangerous knowledge, gradually built an alternative understanding of the world's situation and possibilities. This alternative understanding was not based on prophecy or divine revelation, but on careful observation and rational analysis. It recognized that the Age of Fire had been artificially extended beyond its natural lifespan and that this extension was causing more harm than good. It acknowledged that change was natural and necessary, that preservation was not inherently virtuous, and that the unknown future was not necessarily worse than the familiar present. Most importantly, it affirmed that humans had the right and responsibility to make their own choices about their destiny, rather than accepting the choices made for them by others. This principle of self-determination became the foundation for resistance to the established order and the source of hope for genuine alternatives. The emergence of this alternative understanding created the conditions that made the chosen undead's genuine choice possible. Without the foundation of knowledge and analysis provided by generations of doubters and dissidents, the final hero would have faced the same limited options as all their predecessors. In this sense, the chosen undead's achievement was not purely individual, but but represented the culmination of a long process of growing awareness and resistance. They succeeded not because they were uniquely special, but because they inherited the accumulated wisdom of all who had questioned the system before them. This collective aspect of their success provides hope for the future, regardless of which choice they ultimately made. If the chosen undead linked the fire, they did so with full knowledge and genuine consent, breaking the pattern of deception that had characterized previous cycles. If they rejected the flame, they did so with support from a tradition of resistance that would help guide the transition to whatever came next, the ending of the Age of Fire. Whether through final linking or ultimate rejection, marked more than just a change in cosmic administration. It represented the triumph of authentic choice over systematic manipulation, of honest evaluation over comfortable delusion, of courage over fear. The world that would emerge from this transition would face its own challenges and uncertainties. The Age of Dark, if it came, would not be paradise any more than the Age of Fire had been. The continued Age of Fire, if it was chosen, would still struggle with the fundamental tensions between preservation and growth, order and freedom, safety and possibility. But whatever challenges lay ahead would be faced by people who had reclaimed their right to make their own decisions about their fate. The culture of systematic self-deception that had characterized the late Age of Fire would be replaced by a commitment to honest evaluation and authentic choice. This cultural transformation was perhaps more important than any specific political or cosmic outcome. A society that valued truth over comfort, growth over security, and individual dignity over collective conformity would be better equipped to handle whatever challenges it faced. Such a society might make mistakes, but they would be honest mistakes rather than the systematic self-betrayal that had characterized the Age of Fire. The lessons of Gwyn's sacrifice would not be forgotten, but they would be understood differently. His willingness to pay any price for his beliefs would be recognized as both admirable and dangerous. His fear of change would be seen as understandable, but ultimately destructive. His manipulation of others would be condemned, while his genuine desire to protect what he valued would be honored. Future generations would learn from his example without repeating his mistakes. They would understand that some prices are too high to pay, that some changes must be accepted, and that some choices cannot be made for others without their consent. The flame itself, whether kept burning or allowed to die, would become a symbol of these lessons rather than an object of blind devotion. If preserved, it would represent the value of tradition tempered by wisdom. If extinguished, it would represent the courage to embrace uncertainty in pursuit of growth. In either case, the Age of Fire's true legacy would not be its specific achievements or failures, but its ultimate lesson. That even the most powerful and well-intentioned individuals can create systems of immense suffering when they allow their fears to override their wisdom, their desire to preserve the past, to blind them to the possibilities of the future. This lesson would resonate across whatever ages followed, serving as a warning against the temptation to prevent change through artificial means, and a reminder that genuine preservation requires allowing things to grow and transform naturally, rather than trying to freeze them in perfect moments that were never as perfect as they seemed. The fading light of the Age of Fire would thus become not a symbol of loss, but of liberation, the end of an age that had outlived its purpose, and the beginning of new possibilities for those brave enough to embrace them. Whether those possibilities would be realized or squandered would depend on the choices of future generations, but at least they would be genuine choices rather than the predetermined patterns that had characterized the 1,000 years of artificial extension. The greatest tragedy of Gwyn's sacrifice was not that it failed to preserve his age permanently, no age can last forever, but that it prevented his age from ending with dignity and grace. allowing the next age to begin with hope and confidence rather than fear and desperation. The greatest triumph of the chosen undead was not that they made the correct choice about the flame. There may have been no objectively correct choice, but that they made an authentic choice based on complete knowledge and genuine freedom, proving that such choice was possible even in a system designed to prevent it. In the end, the complete story of the Age of Fire is neither a tale of pure heroism nor one of simple villainy, but a complex exploration of how good intentions can create terrible consequences when pursued without wisdom, how fear can corrupt even the noblest purposes, and how the courage to make difficult choices remains the most important virtue in an uncertain world. The flame may burn or die, ages may rise and fall, but the example of authentic choice in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform will endure, as long as conscious beings face difficult decisions about their collective future. The chosen undead's greatest gift to the world was not the preservation or transformation of any particular order, but the demonstration that such choices belong to those who must live with their consequences, rather than those who would impose their will through manipulation and deception. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the restoration of genuine choice to a world that had forgotten what choice meant was the most any hero could hope to achieve, the most any age could ask of its successors, the most that any sacrifice, however noble or misguided, could ultimately accomplish. The Age of Fire ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with possibility. The possibility that future generations will choose more wisely than their predecessors, that they will build better systems based on better principles, that they will find ways to preserve what is valuable without sacrificing what is essential. Whether they will succeed in realizing these possibilities remains to be seen. But thanks to the courage of one final hero who refused to accept predetermined choices, they will at least have the chance to try. Epilogue. Ashes to embers. As we come to the end of our long journey through the tragedy of Lord Gwyn and the Age of Fire, we find ourselves not with easy answers, but with profound questions that echo across the centuries. The story of the first flame's kindling and eventual fate serves as both warning and inspiration, a tale of how even the greatest intentions can lead to cycles of suffering when driven by fear rather than wisdom. Gwyn's original sacrifice was born of genuine love for his world and his people. He saw the beauty of the Age of Fire, the magnificent cities, the flourishing of art and culture, the triumph of light over the grey stagnation of the Age of Ancients. When that beauty was threatened by the flame's natural fading, he chose to preserve it through the ultimate sacrifice, offering his own soul as fuel for the dying fire. But in making that choice, Gwyn revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of preservation itself. True preservation does not mean keeping things exactly as they are, frozen in perfect moments that were never as perfect as memory suggests. True preservation means allowing the essential qualities of what we value to grow and transform, to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their core identity. The Age of Fire that Gwyn sought to preserve was not a static achievement, but a living, growing civilization that had emerged from the chaos of the Dragon War. Its beauty lay not in any particular configuration of power or culture, but in the creative energy that had allowed it to develop from the first flame's initial spark. By trying to freeze that energy in place, Gwyn transformed it from a force of creation into a mechanism of consumption. The 1,000 years that followed his sacrifice demonstrated the futility of this approach. Each cycle of linking required the destruction of the very heroic energy that had made the Age of Fire beautiful in the first place. The system designed to preserve the Age's achievements instead consumed its most precious resource, the individuals capable of creating new achievements. Yet even in its corruption, the Age of Fire continued to produce moments of genuine beauty and meaning. The devotion of the Silver Knights, the optimism of Solaire, the scholars who preserved knowledge across the dark years. These examples remind us that systems of suffering can still contain pockets of genuine virtue, that even the most misguided ages can nurture qualities worth preserving. The challenge for any society is to distinguish between the systems that enable such virtue and the systems that merely exploit it. Gwyn's tragedy was that he confused the preservation of specific institutions with the preservation of the values those institutions were meant to serve. The chosen undead's final choice, whatever form it took, represented the possibility of making this distinction consciously rather than blindly following inherited patterns. Whether they chose to link the fire or let it die, they did so with full knowledge of both the costs and benefits involved. This conscious choice-making is perhaps the most important skill any civilization can develop. It requires the courage to examine inherited beliefs, the wisdom to distinguish between means and ends, and the humility to accept that even well-intentioned choices can have unintended consequences. The story of the Age of Fire teaches us that no age, no matter how beautiful or meaningful, is worth preserving through systematic deception and the exploitation of heroic virtue. It reminds us that change is natural and necessary, that attempts to prevent it often cause more suffering than accepting it would. But it also teaches us that change without wisdom can be destructive, that the rejection of old systems must be accompanied by careful thought about what should replace them. The Age of Dark that might follow the flame's extinction would face its own challenges and temptations, its own opportunities for both creation and corruption. The ultimate lesson is not that any particular choice is always correct, but that the quality of our choices depends on the honesty and courage with which we make them. A decision made in full knowledge of its consequences, with genuine concern for those who will be affected by it, has moral weight regardless of its specific content. This is what makes the chosen undead's decision significant. Not the particular outcome they chose, but the manner in which they chose it, freely, honestly, with full awareness of the alternatives and their implications. In our own world, we face similar challenges of preservation and change, of maintaining what we value while adapting to new circumstances. The story of Gwyn's sacrifice reminds us to examine our own assumptions about what must be preserved and what can be allowed to change.